What's up, everybody? So, about a little over a week ago, I put out a tweet asking listeners who wanted to ask me anything to go ahead and do that, to post on our Patreon page, and that I would do an AMA. Because I know many of you have been asking me so many questions over the years, whether it's what books to read or who is the most interesting guest or what's the most interesting thing you've heard on the show. And so I thought, why not actually do this? It would be fun. And it was recently, our WeWork episode was our 200th episode. So I thought, okay, this will be fun. I did not expect to get this many questions. I think you guys asked over 100. Actually, I know you asked over 100 questions because you asked about 100. There are about 100 comments in the post. So, and a lot of you had multiple questions per comment. And I must say, I was surprised at just how good these questions were. Like, I knew you guys were going to ask interesting questions, but some of them were so different than what I expected to hear. So what I have done is I've compiled all of these into a document, and this thing comes out to like 15 pages long, and I didn't even include all the questions in it. So I'm going to do my best to go through them. I tried to go through them first and kind of write out some notes, but there was so much to say that I realized it was going to take me forever just to write the notes out. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read the questions. The first few I've already read, and I wrote out some notes, but the rest I haven't even read them at all, so I don't know what they are. And I'm going to do my best to start to just go through them right now, and hopefully that'll be fun and interesting for you guys. So the first question I have is from Richard Hughes Jones, and his question is, what's the most standout thing you've learned or maybe changed your opinion on from all your interviews? So I thought about this a bit, and I would have to say China, because when I started the podcast, I had a very rudimentary view of China that was heavily informed by the sort of pre-existing or prevalent view, the neoliberal view of China, that it is this emerging post-developing country that, yes, doesn't have a democracy, but that really reflected cultural distinctions or differences between Western countries and Eastern countries, mandate of heaven, etc. But that ultimately, with the arrow of time and the economic incentives of that sweet, sweet capitalism, that the Chinese would come around and fold themselves into the international order. And there was a moment in that conversation with Anne where I asked her something, or I posed the question with an assumption embedded in it that China was going to move towards a more capitalist and a more democratic system. And she said something along the lines of, yeah, that's not happening. And then she proceeded to just give a very good answer. And throughout the rest of the course of the conversation, and just after that, I became increasingly aware of just how different China was and the China model was to what I thought it was. So that, I would say, is, and that's my recollection of it. If I went back and listened to it, maybe I had already started to form an opinion. Maybe by reading Anne's stuff before having her on, I had already started forming an opinion. But I'm pretty sure that at that period of time, or at that period in time, I didn't have a view on China that's remotely like the one I have today. And it certainly wasn't as educated. So that's my best example, Richard. Next question by Gaz. So, by the way, guys, apologies if I don't pronounce your names right. Remember, my name is Demetri Kofinas, so I know what it's like to have your name mispronounced. I don't get offended by it. You guys, please don't get offended by it if I mispronounce your name. Ghazi Jairudi, I don't know how you pronounce it exactly, Jei. So, Ghazi, your question is, has a guest ever changed the view you strongly held in the duration of an episode? I.e., did you have enough faith in the guest's credentials and the soundness of their argument to change your mind then and there? So this is actually very much like Richard's questions. I mean, Richard's was, what's the most standout thing you've learned and maybe change your opinion on? I actually have a number of these episodes where my opinion was changed. I picked China as the most standout thing I learned just because of the significance of the topic. But in addition to China, I would throw also in Charlie Grant and Elon Musk and Tesla, because it was Charlie who sort of made me perk up my ears and listen, because I had known Charlie for years before I started the podcast, and his father, Jim Grant, who is, again, someone who I admire deeply and who's been a very influential person in my own development in this space. So I know what kind of person Charlie is, and I knew that if he was writing negatively on Tesla, that I needed to listen. And at the time, I had the same view of Elon Musk that everyone else had, that he was the Superman, Tony Starkian innovator, and that we needed more people like him to rescue capitalism. Bill Janeway was like it's something in the 60s. And he wrote the book, Doing Capitalism in the Innovation Economy. And it's interesting because Bill Janeway was pitched to me by one of my producers in 2012 on Capital Account, Justine Underhill, who subsequently worked at RV, at Real Vision. I don't know if she's still there, but you guys might know her. It's a fun fact of history. Justine, I hired her right out of college. So that's a whole nother interesting story. She was a econ major and a theater major from Georgetown. And I still remember to this day the questions I threw at her. I drilled her in that hiring meeting, whatever you call it. And I hired her, but she pitched Bill Janeway to me, and I was like, forget this guy. This guy's like a leftist. I don't want this guy on. He's a progressive. He thinks the Fed is not evil and that banks aren't evil, et cetera, or whatever I thought in my head that Bill Janeway was, and he didn't fit my stereotypical libertarian, banks are evil, Fed is the cause of the root of all the problems in the world, only sound money is the solution to everything. He didn't fit that template, so I dismissed him. And as part of this larger objective that I had in my mind when I started Hidden Forces, which was that primarily I wanted to use the platform as an opportunity to educate myself, re-educate myself, to rid myself of my ideological filters and spectacles, and to see the world as clearly as I possibly could. So, of course, getting Janeway's perspective was important. And I don't know what brought Bill back on my radar. Perhaps it was Tim O'Reilly who brought his name up to me, or maybe it might have also been Robert Johnson, who is the head of the INET of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. Or it may just have been, that sort of group of individuals where I was doing research on one of them or a number of their episodes, and Bill's work kept coming up. So I brought Bill on the podcast, and he really changed my perspective. First of all, reading his book, Doing Capitalism in the Innovation Economy, was, I don't want to use the word like transformational, but it was one of the more important books that I've read in the course of the last 4 to 5 years in terms of helping to change my perspective and really showing me something that I didn't understand that helped me to understand the world better. And that specifically with respect to the positive externalities that government spending has played, and that the government, with its regulations and its constructed incentives, has played in spurring innovation, and the role that it plays in this larger cycle of innovation, of the innovation cycle that Bill Janeway talks about. Sebastian Mallaby, I think that was episode 9, and he changed that episode was on Greenspan because Sebastian had written a biography of Greenspan, an authorized biography, authorized to be clear, not unauthorized, unauthorized biography of Greenspan called, I think it was called The Man Who Knew. And I always had a very skeptical view of Greenspan. I always thought he was a bit of a grifter and an opportunist. And that was sort of validated by the book. There was this one part in the book where Ayn Rand talked about that she actually called him an opportunist. But I also developed an appreciation for his views on gold. I always thought that his move away from gold, from being a gold bug and someone who believed in the gold standard and that moving off the gold standard was a bad thing, to someone who actually felt that the gold standard was unworkable, I gained a newfound appreciation for really the intellectual underpinnings of that perspective. And I think I perhaps also gained a broader perspective for just how complicated the job is and how much we pin on the Fed, but really to what extent is the Fed responsible? And to the extent that it is responsible, how responsible is the cult of personality that we build around it. Because I think that was a really powerful part of the Greenspan administration. And that particular part, the cult of personality, the oracle, the maestro that they used to call him, I always thought it was important, but I think I gained a new appreciation for that. Michael Lind, our episode with him on class wars, that was the name of his book, was also one that really changed my thinking on a framing that I had developed and used to really understand what was going on in both society, politics, but also in the economy, which was the wealth gap and the increasing polarization of wealth distribution in the country. And he got me to change that perspective from thinking about it primarily in terms of wealth to thinking about it in terms of power. And that was a really important framing for me because it helped me to understand why things like universal basic income, which I had a natural aversion to, didn't really get to the root of the problem. Because ultimately, what drives so much of the political discontent isn't simply the fact that some people have less money than others, or some people are struggling, working two jobs, etc. But it's the fact that millions of Americans feel that they don't have a voice. They don't feel empowered. And I think that's a really powerful framing, and that was really important. And of course, Rowan Gray on stablecoin regulations, that was a really important episode for me because I've been an investor in crypto for some time, and it's not something that I talk much about, but I've also been invested in stablecoins. And despite the fact that I had many reasons to want to discount what Rowan Gray had to say, my ears really perked up when we discussed why he felt that stablecoins represented a potentially systemic threat to not just the crypto industry, but to the overall financial industry at scale and absent regulation, and why also they benefit from piggybacking off of the stability created by the fiat dollar system, and that was a privilege that they weren't entitled to. So that changed my thinking a lot. And those who remember that episode or who haven't heard it and want to go back to it, in the introduction to that episode, I think you will find that was very prescient for where we find ourselves today with government regulation and the infrastructure bill that's passing its way through Congress, which incidentally, I think, as the crypto community fights back on these regulations, the more ground they get the government to concede, the more bullish it is for crypto. I've been impressed. I'm watching it, carefully to see, because it reveals just how much support there is, how much popular support there is for the industry among constituents. And ultimately, what matters to politicians is getting reelected, and getting reelected is really about what do the people want and what are the people prepared to demand. And the one thing we know about crypto is it may not be the majority of the people, but it is a very boisterous minority. So I hope that answers your question, Ghazi. Those are the episodes that come to mind. Next question is by Danny. Ready? Danny says, love the show. What's the biggest truth you've learned about yourself, not business or facts, as a result of hidden forces? Well, I have learned that I absolutely love having a podcast, which I think is in many ways similar to having a radio show, which I had many years ago on 91.5 in New York, with the key distinction being that I own everything from the cradle to grave, from nuts to bolts, or whatever the expression is, from soup to nuts. And even if I were to get shut down by one of the main platforms, or all of them, Spotify, Apple, etc., people can always come to my website and listen to my content. And the cost of production, the bare basics of production, are almost nothing. I already own the microphone. I have a space to record in. I need to pay Libsyn, the RSS provider, $50 a month to stream the show. And so while there are costs to doing the podcast the way I want to, just getting my message out there cost almost nothing. And I know that I can always reach all of you, and that's really empowering. So that, I would say, is something I learned, which I couldn't have known if I hadn't started a podcast. But I think the thing that is maybe most important that I've learned in the course of doing this is that I really care about understanding the world as it is and not as I think it is or would like it to be, which is how I spent most of my life. And I think a lot of people see the world that way, or they look for confirmation of their biases. They look for validation of their views because that's easier for a lot of people, and also because people get ahead of themselves. They want to live in their heads, tell themselves stories about how great they are, how smart they are. And reality just becomes a way of fitting those views into the world, as opposed to coming to the world and trying to understand what it's telling you so that you can ultimately be less surprised by tomorrow. That was like a key phrase that I used in the early days. I think I used it in the trailer of the podcast, which was that one of the goals of Hidden Forces is to help you be less surprised by tomorrow. And that was something that I really cared about because I had come to the podcast. I had spent years basically indoctrinating myself after the 2008 financial crisis because my attempts to understand the world had failed miserably. As I've talked about, I was completely blindsided by the government response to the 2008 crisis. And that combined with the Bush administration's foray into Iraq, which I think, now that I think of it, I was also surprised that they went into Iraq. I think there was so much popular opposition to the war, particularly in Europe, that I just didn't believe that the Bush administration would proceed without more support. But it did. And so I clung to an ideological shortcut that basically told me the root of all evil is public policy, that markets are almost entirely self-correcting, and that while they are imperfect, it is much better to have a largely libertarian-style free market, quasi-anarchist society than to have something like what we had in 2008 because of how manifestly corrupt and compromised it was and is. But that view was incorrect, as my episode with Bill Janeway shows, and many other episodes, my episode with Safi Bakal also, and others, where we look at the role of the United States government in the innovation cycle. And so it's not so clear-cut, and ultimately, to bring it back to your question, Danny, I've learned that I really care about engaging in the nuance of things and understanding the world for what it is and not what I would like it to be. And not to toot my own horn here because that's not what I'm doing, but I do think that it takes some level of courage to do that. I do think that I am more fearless today or less fearful than I was before I started this podcast. That I'm prepared to see things as they are, and that takes some level of courage. So that is my answer to you, Danny. The next question is by Donald Andrews. Donald asks, what is the most surprising thing a guest has told you? Well, Danny, you may not be surprised to know that I work very hard not to be surprised. But if I were to pick an episode where I've been surprised, and I thought about this, there are two, really, I think, episodes where I was the most surprised, I think, by what a guest had to say. Because, again, a lot of that surprise or whatever you want to call it happens during the research phase of any podcast. But that said, in the overtime to my episode with Senator Bob Kerrey, who was on the 9/11 Commission, I think there were 10 members of that commission, and he was one of them. And I asked him about 9/11, and he said that it was a conspiracy that went all the way to the highest levels of the Saudi government. And while I was absolutely familiar with the Saudi connection, in fact, that was one of the reasons the question even came up and why I had Senator Kerrey on the podcast, because one of the other commissioners or one of the other members of the commission had been out speaking publicly about this, or at least one, and that was Bob Graham. And so I wanted to know what his thoughts were. I just didn't expect him to be that forthcoming or maybe that direct. And it obviously left a lot of questions open, which is how high and why would the Bush administration have, for example, shepherded the bin Laden family out of the United States after 9/11? How deep do these connections go? And this is where conspiracies come in, and why it's, I think, ridiculous to try to shame people or shoot them down for proposing alternative theories for which there is no conclusive evidence, simply because there is no conclusive evidence, when in fact we now know, in this particular case, but there are other cases with other conspiracies, that the government was lying. So what were they lying about? I'm not saying the government flew commercial airliners into the buildings. I don't think it works that way. And I have thoughts about it, but we'll leave that at that. That's one person who surprised me. Another guest who surprised me was Kyle Bass, who you will remember, those of you who heard this episode, predicted, I guess he didn't necessarily predict it, but he talked about government-engineered pandemics or government-engineered viruses months before we caught wind of what was going on in Wuhan. This was, I think, October we recorded the episode, October 2019 with Kyle. And he said at one point that the CCP was engineering bioweapons that would specifically target Caucasians. And I remember when I released this podcast, there was one tweet in particular, which was like, it had like thousands of likes and I don't even know how many retweets and tons of comments. I mean, the commentary was, I couldn't possibly read all the comments to this tweet. And a lot of people ridiculed what Kyle said. And they put it under the banner of white replacement theory or something like that. Some theory about that supposedly white people have, that they're afraid that they're going to be replaced. But it turns out that as time moves on, we find more and more evidence that this virus was likely engineered in a lab, whether or not it was engineered to be more Caucasian. I know that Kyle Bass has said this on multiple occasions since. I don't know if he actually believes it, how much he believes it, how much it is something that just fits, again, his agenda, which is to alert the country and the government to the dangers of the Chinese government and their objectives. I think it might be something that's kind of in between. I know Kyle feels very strongly about his views, and he's done a lot of great work to raise awareness in the country around that. So I don't know, but those are the two people and two moments in an episode which I think I was most surprised. And you'd probably be able to hear it if you go back and listen, but I have not listened to those episodes since, so that would be interesting to do maybe for me. Next person is James Butwina. James, I got to say, by the way, I see your name a bunch. I think it's also on Twitter. I see it sometimes in commenting or liking tweets. And for whatever reason, I always synonymize your name with Africa. I have no idea why. Oh, kind of like early 20th century Africa. And I don't know. I don't know what it is. Almost like the movie Ghost in the Darkness. I see that whole thing, sort of the railroads and Val Kilmer. So you ask, what year would you want to be born in and why? 1900, assuming not drafted in World War I or World War II, 2000, or 2100. So I guess this depends. It depends on whether or not I get to keep the same access to healthcare that I have today. You know, I don't want to go back to 13th century Europe and end up dying from, like, I don't know, the flu or something. You know, I think we all take for granted just how advanced our healthcare systems are today. So let's just, for purposes, let's get rid of that. And let's assume that we're good in terms of healthcare systems, et cetera. The only year I can think of, like, to put an actual date on would be like 1947, California. And the reason is because I'd want to grow up and come of age in the period of the 1960s, counterculture, you know, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I think that generation I mean, from people I've spoken to who really lived through that period, who were hippies or who at the very least engaged with the culture, it sounded like a really remarkable time. It sounded like a really optimistic time and a beautiful time for self-exploration and for cultural renewal. So I would definitely choose that date. In terms of periods that I would like to live in or experience, not necessarily be born in, I'd love to have the opportunity to experience Athens between the end of the Second Persian War and the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, maybe the very early stages of the Peloponnesian War as well, to see what it was like at that time and to experience the culture, the humor, and everything else. I would also love to experience the plains, the American plains, in the period right after the end of the Civil War, because so much change happened. This was the height of the Comanche Empire, and which was at the time a bigger, more formidable tribe and collective than even the Apaches were. And they were the fiercest warriors on horseback that we know of in the plains. In fact, there's a great book written by, and I forget the author's name, but I read the book and I had intended to have him on. The book is called Empire of the Summer Moon. It's a history of the Comanche Empire. So that period would have been pretty fascinating. Africa in the early 20th century, James, to the point I mentioned earlier about how you remind me of your name or something reminds me of that. That looked like a really amazing place to be, a place to live. It was still so raw and wild, and yet there was some inflow of civilization coming. The railroads were being built into the continent. And so you had the ability to traverse it, but still go through so many areas that were just pure nature. Constantinople, at the height of the Ottoman Empire, that would have been also very interesting. And I also would love to have explored parts of the earth where there was no civilization. You know, to be able to walk through Australia before human beings had ever inhabited it, or go island hopping in the Polynesian Islands before they had been, well, in the Polynesian Islands, it's fine. You know, so what? People didn't really do much to change the landscape there. So that would have been interesting as well. Next question is by Andreas Hopf. Andreas asks, how do you manage to remain an optimist and keep soldiering on in view of the growing state of social, ecological, and economic disrepair and nihilism shining through many of your guests' writings and shared experiences? Andreas, that's a great question. First of all, I've been through periods of darkness in my life where I've gotten depressed at the world, at the state of affairs, and really allowed that negativity to affect my life. But that is something that I think I more or less rid myself of after being cured of my brain tumor and understanding that the worst things in the world that will happen to me and that will impact my life are things that are idiosyncratic. They're idiosyncratic risks. They're things that will happen just to me that I can't possibly predict. And then, unless I'm going to start worrying about all of those things, which is not something I recommend, I pretty much don't let any of these things affect me, whether or not the likelihood is that we're going to have a bad outcome. But also because I think it's easy to assume that all the negative outcomes that we have in our heads about what could go wrong are actually going to happen. In fact, I think one of the reasons why we tend to think about all the potential disasters and catastrophes is exactly so that they don't happen, so that we actually do something to prevent them from happening. And so maybe the way in which, actually, I think I just answered my question, or I answered your question, which is I think the reason that I'm able to remain an optimist is because I feel like I'm actually doing something with those negative premonitions. I'm actually putting out a podcast. I'm thinking about them. I'm trying to help myself and others do something to manage the risks, either as individuals or members of the community. So I think that's how I manage to remain optimistic. So I hope that answers your question. Matthew Z asks, What has been your experience living outside New York City so far, i.e., rural versus urban? Do you think either living environment is better for humanity? Great question, Matthew. I love living in the countryside. For those who don't know, I live in what is effectively an exurb. It's as close to being, I don't know, maybe it's considered rural. I'm surrounded by farmland. I live at the very, very, very end of the North Fork of Long Island, and I get most of my food from farms. I wake up in the morning, I'm surrounded by nature. I absolutely love it. I don't miss the city at all. Yeah, but I don't know if that's true. Sometimes I miss the city. I miss certainly doing in-person conversation with guests, but I've always loved nature. And while I certainly would not have wanted to live here when I was younger, that was entirely because I loved being around people and I was socializing and going to parties and going to clubs. But that's not something that I care about anymore, so that's not really an issue. And in terms of whether or not I think it's better for humanity, I think that's really up to people. I think human beings are urban creatures. We're not born to live in nature. Even now, I don't live in nature. I live in a more rural community, but it's still a community. So I think it's really a personal thing. I don't know that I can make a blanket statement about it, but I would say I think it's an extreme to imagine that we can all live in tightly packed urban environments. I don't think that that's healthy. I think a mix is actually really good. So that's my answer to that. Sebastian R. asks, are there any topics that you find interesting, in or out of scope for the podcast, doesn't matter, that you keep coming across, but that you could not get yourself to do a deep dive on yet? So yes, there are a number of such podcasts, episodes, subjects. One is quantum computing. The reason I haven't done that is because the obvious fact that it will require a lot of research for me to get to a place of basic competency and where I will be able to provide some value to listeners so that the podcast isn't largely a waste of time or isn't just me bringing on someone who's going to talk to me, but most of the stuff's going to go over my head. And I think it's absolutely something I can do. I think it is worth doing at some point. But again, I need to be able to have the time to do it. And so that's why I haven't done it so far. I've wanted to do an episode on the antebellum South for a very long time. Or rather, let me say it this way. I've long been fascinated by trying to understand what the antebellum South was really like. Not Gone with the Wind or 7 Years a Slave or Django Unchained or some other Hollywood depiction of what the South was like, but what it actually was like. Understanding that the single most important fact was that it was so culturally distinct and economically distinct from the North that we fought the bloodiest war in our history over it. And I think it would actually be very helpful for people to understand that. And it's also fascinating. And there is one book that I have read on this because there isn't like a huge body of literature on it. And I don't quite know why that is. Maybe there is, and it's all academic, and you have to really work to find it. That might be the truth. But the book that I would recommend for people who are interested in that is called Fall of the House of Dixie. And it's a fascinating history. And maybe now that I'm thinking about it, I really should make an effort to actually do an episode on this. Another episode that I wanted to do and that I tried to do early on, but unfortunately the author of the book Land of Desire, which I've mentioned to listeners before, one of my favorite books, he was unable to do the podcast because he was dealing with some personal issues that I don't imagine have gotten any better. And I didn't really have anyone else in mind that I would bring on. The episode that I wanted to do was History of Consumer Capitalism. Because again, similar to something like the plantation economies of the South, you're talking about an enormous change. Well, I guess in terms of the South, it was a change from the plantation economies and plantation culture and society to something more of a market-oriented system versus the transition from investment-driven capitalism, industrial capitalism, to consumer capitalism, and how that transformed American society. So that's an episode I've wanted to do for a long time, and maybe at some point I will. I've also wanted to do one on Carl Jung and the collective unconscious and mythology and all that sort of Joseph Campbell type stuff that I've talked about on the podcast, maybe also psychedelics, and maybe one on nationalism, but nationalism from the perspective of how we've created it in various instances in our development. Case in point, the Balkans. Mark Mazawar has written a number of books on the Balkans, whether primarily Greece. He wrote Hitler's Greece, for example. He also wrote Salonika, City of Ghosts, but he also wrote a book on the Balkans, and it's a fascinating book, and it really shows you how much of the stuff that we take for granted as being endemic or being very foundational to who we are is actually constructed, our national identities. So those are just off the top of my head, Sebastian. Next question is by Isaac Barron. Isaac asks, what conspiracy theory or mainstream or something the mainstream would view as such do you believe in? Can be current or old, but not something that's already been definitively exposed. Well, 9/11, I mentioned my conversation with Senator Bob Kerrey. I obviously don't believe the official story. That doesn't mean that I believe that George Bush was spearheading an attack against the United States. Maybe there was a lot of sort of looking the other way. Maybe there were covert programs being run that kind of got mixed in with other programs that led to the attacks, something similar to what we know about Operation Mongoose and the operations in Cuba to take out Fidel Castro, and how some conspiracy theories point to those having been turned back and turned on Kennedy and leading to Kennedy's assassination, which is why Bobby, who was running those operations, then felt like he couldn't expose because they had made promises to the Soviets after the Cuban Missile Crisis that they wouldn't try to reassassinate Fidel Castro. That's a conspiracy theory that I absolutely believe in. That's the best one I can think of now. I mean, there are other ones around population control that I think, does it qualify as a conspiracy if elites want to try and control the population? I don't know if that really counts as a conspiracy. I mean, I feel like, again, a lot of times conspiracy is really about the qualitative experience of what it's like to actually engage with the theory. It doesn't seem to me insane that people would try to manage population growth. Something that we know about from the 1970s, that this was a concern, the Club of Rome and the limits to growth, etc. The next question is by VR. VR asks, what idea do you feel was downloaded to you by unseen forces that was meant to be a valuable message to all of us? I guess VR, you're talking about how I mention, or I've mentioned on other podcasts, about my experience facing death and what it was like to wake up after this really life-altering surgery that brought me back from a place of dementia. This is really tough, man. I probably should have read this question before and not answered it because it's so difficult. I don't know how, this would take me forever to try and answer. I think before this experience, I had a much more literal view of the world. And obviously a much more empirical one, a much more atheistic one. The experience of going through something like this taught me that there is truly a mystery in the world, that we really don't know everything, and that many of the stories that we tell ourselves through generations, myths that resonate for a reason, and that they speak to some deeper truth about the world. And it taught me about having faith in a way that, again, it's not biblical. I'm not wedded to a particular religion. I'm not a theist in the sense that I don't believe in some biblical Old Testament God. But I've learned that there is perhaps a hidden order to the world that science would argue against. And it's hard to, again, this is not an argument that, first of all, I'm inclined to make, or that I think I could make, because that sort of defeats the purpose of it. you sort of learn that there are things about the world that might be true or are true that you believe fully, but you can't prove. And I think the litmus test for that, at the very least, is not needing to convince anyone of that, just knowing it. And I guess that's the best way I could describe it. I did an episode on philosophical mathematics with Ray Monk. We talked about Wittgenstein, and Wittgenstein's insight was that the paradoxes in mathematics exist because of the limitations of language. And I think this also speaks to our relationship to God and to the mystery of existence. So that's my answer, VR. Guys, I'm getting close to running out of steam on these questions, and I have so many more to go. I see that I'm not even close to halfway through here. So what I'm thinking is I'm probably going to have to answer the rest of these either in a separate recording that I'll release at some future date, or I may just try and do the rest of these for the overtime feed, because there's so many great questions here. I mean, you guys, I have these broken down in terms of like kind of general stuff for the podcast that's miscellaneous, personal, which is what we've been going through up until now. But I also have a lot of great ones related to hidden forces and the business model and macroeconomy and crypto. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to answer two more questions, the last two that I have here. Well, actually, we just answered the last one that was kind of personal stuff. I'll answer two questions on the business model and on podcasting. And then what I can do is I can try to answer those other questions in a separate recording that I can publish on the feed, or I can do it all for premium subscribers. So the next question I have here is from Brendan Neff. Brendan says, I'm curious about the business model of Hidden Forces. How subscriber growth? Do you find that certain guests or topics lead to increased churn or subscription growth? CAC, LTV trends? How are the economics of Patreon as a platform versus something else like Substack or rolling your own, etc.? So in terms of subscriber growth, people who are actually subscribed to platforms like Apple or Overcast or Spotify, I don't have access to those numbers. The only real numbers I have access to are downloads or streams from the RSS feed from the server. And those numbers have gradually gone up over the course of the entire history of the podcast. So it stands to reason that subscriber growth will have also gone up. Engagement is not something that I can measure from the data that I get from Libsyn, which is the RSS service provider that I have, but I can certainly measure it from social media. That's gone up. In terms of paid subscribers, that's also done really well. I launched a subscription in, I think it was, early 2019, and we are now at 2,000 paid subscribers. It's been a huge success. I have a number of tiers, as you guys know, and those have also done very well over the course of the podcast. And in terms of Patreon as a platform versus Substack or something else, I'm not going to be on Patreon forever. And in fact, I think sooner than you all might think, I think I'll have an option that I'll be able to share with all of you that will move us off to a different platform, which will be much better for everyone. I know a lot of people have been asking for an integrated premium feed that incorporates both the overtime and the regular episode. That's in the works as well. Patreon's been great. The fees are very good. I think they've upped their fees now, but I got grandfathered into the old structure, but it leaves a lot to be desired. And I am looking at two different platforms. One is Substack, which has the benefit of having a lot of people already with accounts on it, but it comes with the cost of having very high fees. And then there's another platform called Supercast, which we've been looking at that we might end up using instead. But that's my answer, Brendan. The last question is, there's another question by Liam Taipei, which is kind of similar to this. Liam says, I'm so impressed by the show's overtime segment, and I'm really intrigued to know how you went about setting the show up for the subscription model from the beginning. So my question is, you started the overtime segment from episode 72, at the start of 2019, when you started in early 2017? Did you have a rough timeline in mind as to when you'd start the overtime, for example, after 2 years? Or did you plan to launch it once you'd hit targets, download numbers or episode numbers? Put another way, when does a podcaster know when their audience is ready to be offered the option of paid content? Well, it's a great question. I don't know if there's like a way to know when your audience is ready. I didn't know, Liam. I didn't know if people were ready. It really was an experiment, and I had reasons to doubt whether they were ready or not because I didn't have this straight up, financial podcast or financial media platform like Real Vision or like Grant's Interest Rate Observer or like Tony Greer's Navigator newsletter or Grant Williams's Things That Make You Go, I didn't have this straightforward transactional product that said, if you pay, you get access to information that will make you a better investor and ultimately recoup you the cost of your subscription. But it turned out to work. I mean, when I started the podcast, it was a labor of love. I got satisfaction out of doing it. That was more than enough. I didn't want to do sponsors, but it came to a point in time where I needed to launch a subscription. It didn't make sense anymore for me to continue to put so much time, energy, and money into something without actually turning it into a business. So that's ultimately what drove me to do it. If that need was not there, I probably never would have put any of it behind a paywall. So I hope that answers your question, Liam. And by the way, guys, if you have any of you who I answered these questions to, feel free to reach out again if you want clarification. I hope I was able to answer your questions here, but if you wanted more clarity, feel free to reach out. Next question is Gordon. So Gordon asks, what is your process like for preparing your interview notes? When I read the books you discuss, I take notes as I go. It takes me many hours and revisions, and I realize they're never as concise or eloquent as yours. The rundowns are great intros to the topics. Well, I'm glad, Gordon, that they're great intros for you. They certainly are the essential things for me. I mean, I go to great lengths to create them. There is some level of embellishment that maybe I wouldn't do if I didn't know that people were going to be reading them. But for the most part, these are pretty much the documents that I was creating for a long time before I ever put them behind a paywall. How do I put these rundowns together? I guess the first thing I do before I write any questions is I answer the question of why do I care? That's the first question that's at the top of every rundown. Because if I don't answer that question first, like what's important here? Like why was this book interesting? Was it interesting? What did I like about it? What stuck out to me? What do I think other people will like about it? And why ultimately should anyone else care to listen to this episode? That's the first question I work really hard to answer. Once I answer that question, the rest of the questions just flow. And what I tend to do, like say if I'm reading a book, is I'll write interesting, either I'll pull passages straight out of the book, and you'll see those in the quote sections of the rundowns, and I will then revisit those later. And then from those sections, which made impressions on me while I was reading, if I'm reading a book, if it's a paper, whatever it is, I will then formulate questions from that. Sometimes I'll formulate questions in real time as I'm reading the book and come back and sort of incorporate them. But I tend to find that there are just so many questions that come out of any kind of reading that I do. So you were asking me like what process is like, but I guess that's my process. I mean, I read, I think. Sometimes I'll go down some additional rabbit holes, maybe read some sections from a different book that I've read in the past just to refamiliarize myself with something. I'll probably watch some videos. I watch a bunch of guest interviews. Like if I have a guest coming on the podcast, I'll do a lot of research on that guest. I'll watch a lot of stuff. I'll try to think about, what did other podcast hosts miss that I would like to drill this person on. I also put a lot of time and energy into thinking about, what the person is like. I imagine the interview in my head before I actually do it. I'll even talk out loud to myself and actually kind of enact the interview and work through questions. This is something else that I do that if you were to see me, you'd think I was crazy. But that's my answer, Gordon. Oh, I see you actually have a second question, Gordon, which is how do you go about deciding who to speak to for your episodes? That's a great question. Everyone always asks me that. That's like a very common question. So it depends. I mean, in the beginning, when I first had the podcast, it was either individuals who I really wanted to speak to, who I reached out to, or it was topics that I was really interested in. And then I went looking for experts who could talk about them. Something that's happened recently in the last few years is that most of my guests are actually people that come to me directly through their publicists almost always. That's how we got the Secretary of Defense on the podcast. That's how Howard Marks, the fund manager, came on the podcast. That's how Tim Grover was introduced to me. So that's most of the ways that I get my guests. I also go through every now and then, every few months, I'll go through Amazon and I will look for interesting books. And I actually did that recently and I found a ton of very interesting books. And I reached out to the publicists, and so I get those books delivered to me and I read them. You know, one of the things that I'm conscious of is I don't want the podcast to become basically like a book review, because books are kind of a shortcut to get into a particular topic, but that isn't always possible. And a lot of times there are episodes that are worth doing. A classic example is what I mentioned earlier about quantum computing, where there isn't like a book that can help us do an episode on it, that can be the shortcut to it. An example of where I was facilitated in that regard was on information theory. I wanted to do an episode on information theory, and you might recall we did one with Jimmy Soni on Claude Shannon, which was sort of a proximate way of doing an episode on information theory because, of course, Claude Shannon wrote A Mathematical Theory of Communication, but I had wanted to do an episode on information theory because I had read James Glake's book, The Information, and that really helped me get a coherent grasp on what information theory was in a way that would enable me to do an episode. So that's kind of the tension. If there were a similar book on quantum computing, I would read it in a heartbeat and have the author on. And that would be the beginning of a series of episodes on the subject because I would have gotten a great introduction to it. So there's always that tension. For example, I also want to do an episode on MEV, minor extractable value, which for those of you who don't know is a term from the Ethereum community. And it has to do with transaction ordering and some of the inefficiencies and challenges to making the Ethereum blockchain more, making it fairer and scaling challenges. So that's an example of something that there is no book for. So anyway, that's sort of how I choose my guests. I'm trying to think. I mean, I don't want to sell short, though, the extent to which I contemplate things that I find interesting and then go and look for guests to talk about those things. So and we kind of, again, we did kind of touch on that a little bit when you guys asked me whoever it was that asked me the question earlier about like what episodes would I be interested in doing that I haven't done yet. So that's my answer to your second question, Gordon. William asks a question that's similar to Gordon's first question, which is, William writes, you obviously study a ton about your guest and the topics before the conversation, but I wonder what are some other things that you do that aren't so obvious that makes the podcast outshine others? Particularly, what advice would you give to someone who would like to follow your path but lacks such hosting experience? Well, so I kind of answered the first part of your question, William, already, I think, pretty completely. What advice would I give to someone who'd like to follow my path but lacks such hosting experience? Well, look, William, when I got into radio, that was the first time I did anything like this. I had zero experience, absolutely zero experience writing a show, producing a show, booking it, hosting it, and I did it all myself. I didn't have a staff or anything, and I had a natural affinity for it, as I've talked about on other podcasts where I've been interviewed. So if you have a natural talent for something or a natural gift for something, you don't need to have any experience. And you don't really know if you have a natural gift for it unless you try. So I would say here's the advice I would give. I would first say to get clear on why you want to do something. I think most people want to do a podcast because other people are doing podcasts and it looks cool, or people they admire are doing it, it looks cool, or they want to satisfy their ego. And so that's why they want to do it. You need to get clear on why you want to do it. And if you really do want to do it and it's something that comes from the heart and your motivations are pure, then I would say absolutely do it. And don't worry about whether you have experience or not. You'll find your own process. I'm not actually someone who advises people, and I'm not saying this is actually the correct path. I think I would have benefited from being able to take advice from others better. For various reasons, I grew up shunning advice and always going my own way because I grew up in an environment where I got pushed a lot. A lot of stuff was pushed onto me every single day, and a lot of the stuff that wasn't consistent and wasn't honoring my own dreams and desires. So I had to really develop an antipathy for other people's opinions in order to be able to manifest my own dreams. So I don't necessarily think this is the way to go, but I never ever try to follow someone else's path. I never look for existing systems. When people tell me that you can't do something this way, that it's always done this way, I say, great, that's even more reason for me to go do it the way I thought I should do it. That's how I started my TV show. I had zero experience. I didn't care what anyone else was doing. I followed my heart. I followed my vision. That's the best advice I can give, William. I'm going to keep actually answering a few more questions, guys. There's another question here by Andreas Hopf, which is actually similar to Gordon's second question, which is, how do you source and then convince your guests to make themselves available for an episode? This is a little nuanced. So, Andreas, I will say, how do I convince the people that I reach out to? So, as I've said, I've reached out to people and I've gotten them on. I'm trying to think of like the biggest coup where I actually reached out to someone and got them on and they were a really big get for me. Well, I don't know. I mean, I reached out to Jillian Tett. I had met her at a conference in New York at the very beginning of the time that I had the podcast. And she didn't exactly turn me down, but she kind of ignored me. And I persisted. And I tried to be as charming as I could. I tried to read Jillian as an individual as best as I could. I imagined that someone with her intellect and success in life, but who was also a woman, had to deal with a lot of bullshit. And so I didn't want to approach her. I didn't think she didn't come across to me as someone that needed to have her ego stroked. Some people, they need to have their ego stroked, and the most effective way to reach out to them and convince them is to compliment them. She didn't seem like someone like that. She seemed like a really straight person. Someone I really had admiration for. So I tried just to be as honest as I could with her and just tell her, look, I really admire your work. I'd like to have you on. Here is why I think you should come on. And then I proceed to tell people a bit about the audience. I might tell them about our distribution on various airlines. I might have told her that we were on British Airways, for example, because she's a Brit. That's how I got her. I'm trying to think of there are cases also where it's a weird thing because sometimes, trying to convince a guest to come on the podcast is kind of like dating. You have to thread a fine line between being persistent and being creepy, because if you overdo it, and also overdoing it depends. I used to live in Italy. In Italy, overdoing it looks very different than it does in the US. It's very difficult to overdo it in terms of persistence in Italy as a man if you're trying to pick up a woman. Whereas, let's say in, I don't know, maybe a Japanese culture, it's different. Certainly it's different in the US. And so it depends on who you're speaking to, depending on how well you know that person from afar, from up close, you can get some read on them. And so that's the thing too. How many times do you want to follow up? What's the period between following up? I try and develop good relationships sometimes with intermediaries. I was so close in the very early days of the podcast to having the head of the Bank of International Settlements on the podcast. And I think the only reason it didn't happen was because I was persistent about trying to get an in-studio recording to happen. And I was, back in the day, I was persistent about everyone showing up in person. And for good reason. First of all, you have if you're a charming person, if you like people, if you're honest, that comes across, and well-intentioned, that really comes across in person, and it makes the other guests feel at ease. And so that makes it for a better interview. Being in person is just a better interview. But also like I get to, what's the point of, for me, one of the things early on that I just knew was that I wanted to meet these people. What's the point of having a podcast and being in New York City and to not actually meet these people in person? Like I got to meet the Secretary of Defense in person. That was really cool. And I got a lot of information out of that experience. Just the visceral, qualitative aspects of interviewing someone in person. But then also in many cases, I get to develop relationships with those people that persist. And that's really cool. And when someone also meets you in person, they remember you. They might tell their contacts about you. That's what happened with Tim O'Reilly. A number of guests would come on the podcast later on and mention that Tim O'Reilly had recommended my podcast to them. So anyway, I developed a great relationship with the head of media at the BIS, and it was a great relationship. That's why we ended up getting Claudio Borio on the podcast, basically the chief economist of the BIS. So that's, look, I mean, best advice is be honest. Don't be a blowhard. Don't talk about yourself. Be concise when you reach out to guests. Respect their time. Always respect their time. Always be respectful. Never take it personally. People are busy. Don't get upset if someone doesn't get back to you. That's not necessarily because they don't respect you. It might be because they don't respect you, but that's not your problem. It's usually just because people are busy. And, sometimes people reach out to me and you can only imagine how many emails I get. So I haven't always been able to respond. Next question is by Mark Kahn. What's up, Mark? We've interacted before. Your question is Hidden Forces the climax of your career path or just a stepping stone on the way to something else? If something else, what is it that you ultimately aspire to? So great question, Mark. No, it isn't a stepping stone. I wouldn't say it's a stepping stone to something else. I have no idea what's next. This is what I love doing now. Work is no longer for me the most important thing. It was up until the first couple of years of this podcast, because I had gone through that period between the end of my old TV show and my descent into dementia, and then getting brain surgery and having to really come back into the world after a prolonged period of absence and finding my way again. I had this chip on my shoulder to recreate something and to feel that really wonderful experience that I missed from my days with Capital Account and my days with covering the spread on 91.5. But I've since sort of satisfied that urge, and now Hidden Forces had just become this really wonderful way to spend my time, to live in the world of my professional career. But for me, family and my personal life is the priority today, and it's really about balancing those two. I do absolutely believe that more interesting career things will come along that will completely challenge me, that will be totally different from podcasting. I have no idea what those things will be. But within podcasting itself, I'm absolutely doing something and bringing a new twist to the podcast. You guys don't know this, but my wife is an operations guru. She's a strategist and works with founders and CEOs to help scale their businesses. And she's been helping me do that with Hidden Forces. And I'm going to be releasing, you guys probably saw, well, I hope you did, those of you who are signed up to our mailing list. I actually have to check on this because I feel like we ran into some issues where people didn't actually get the emails. But I sent out a mass email to like our list of like 10,000 newsletter subscribers to sign up for a newsletter that I'm going to be releasing. So I've been collecting emails for the last several years and I didn't do anything with them. And the very beginning of the podcast I would like send out weekly email blasts every time a podcast would get released. But then I realized that like that was redundant. Most people weren't subscribing. They didn't really need that. So Celia, my wife, had a brilliant idea for a newsletter called Get Smart, the Get Smart newsletter, and which I love. It's not to be confused with Get Smart, the TV show from like the 60s with those detective, or the movie with not Robert De Niro, the little guy, the short guy that was in Taxi. Why am I blanking on the guy's name? Anyway, not to be confused with that movie with John Travolta and that little guy, who I actually met now I'm going on a tangent, but I met him at a New York City musical when I was a kid, which was so cool. Anyway, so I'm really excited for that. Celia has been wonderful and really helped me, and we're getting all our ducks in a row to finally do it. And I don't want to kind of tell you what's going to change with the subscription, but you're going to be very happy. And I'm going to make sure to really reward those of you who have been subscribers all of this time with some really awesome changes to the content. So that's my answer to you, Mark. I've got here a question by Dallas C. Kennedy. Dallas asks, where do you see Hidden Forces a few years from now? 5 years? Do you plan to be doing it 10 years from now? A media empire? If not, HF, what's the alternative? That's kind of more or less the same answer I gave Mark, Dallas. So I also met Dallas. Dallas was actually the very first scholar we ever had. I never really advertised the scholar tier, but it's a subscription, a monthly subscription where you get to do an hour-long call with me. And Dallas didn't do the calls, but he racked up a few of them, and then he asked me for a lunch in New York City, so I was happy to meet him. And so anyway, Dallas, I hope you're doing well. I hope you got an answer to my question with Mark. Ken Smith asks something similar, which is, do you have a specific goal or outcome you are trying to achieve with Hidden Forces that, once achieved, would make you move on to something else? If so, what is that goal? That's a little bit of a different question, I guess. So, Ken, my goal with Hidden Forces is to be part of the conversation, to use the platform to educate myself on things that matter to me, and to help educate all of you. So I don't know that ever is going to be achieved, but I do imagine that there will come a point in time where I feel that the medium itself is no longer sufficient and I want to tell stories in a different way. I could see myself trying to do more narrative type content. Maybe do fewer episodes, but do more constructed stuff where I tell a bigger story. I could see that. I see here that Ghazi asked another question. So, confession, guys, I have my social media producer, Kate, who recently joined the team and has been really great, put together this list. So it looks like some of you asked questions. I mentioned your questions earlier on, but we're going to touch on some other ones again because she put them in order of relevance. Ghazi asks, if you had to switch career paths today and start over based on the collective wisdom of your guests and your takeaways from them, what would you do and what are the tools, i.e. as in mindset, fields of study, people you should meet, that you would use in order to pursue this new career? Well, wow. I mean, the short answer is I don't know. It's such a impossible, in some ways, it's constructed to be an impossible question to answer because I'm looking back with the experience that I have today that I wouldn't have had I not taken the path that I took. And the thing about me also, Ghazi, is that I have this insatiable curiosity, but I also get bored very easily. So what I do now is in many ways the ideal thing for me because I get to focus on whatever I want to focus on. There is the weekly pressure of needing to put out content. So it's not entirely true. There is some level of knowing that I need to produce a certain amount of content and I need to get it out and it needs to be interesting. So that has some impact on my choices. But for the most part, I just get to do whatever I want. That said, there were certain experiences. I mean, I've often thought about an interview that I had out of college, and this would have been actually not exactly out of college because I worked for a year in Italy, which was one of the best decisions I ever made. But when I got back that summer, the summer of 2005, I interviewed for a job at Lehman Brothers. And I turned down the opportunity to work in investment banking at Lehman Brothers, which I regret now when I think about it, and I can explain why I regret it. But I turned it down because it felt so soulless, which it was, and it would have been really hard for me to work such insane hours at such a soulless job. I mean, the hours felt intimidating at the time. I mean, subsequently, I would work in excess of what those hours would have demanded when I worked for myself. But I remember it's being something like 7 a.m. or 7:30 a.m. to 10 p.m. But the opportunity to do that would have been really something else because of what happened subsequently. To have been able to work at Lehman Brothers from 2005 until 2008 and be there for the collapse and in investment banking. And with the knowledge that I know now, man, I mean, that would just be it would be an incredible opportunity. And I really do find all that stuff fascinating. I love it. I didn't realize then it seemed so boring to me, finance, but the more I learned about it, the more I've just fallen in love with its complexity and all of the puzzles that you encounter in the business. I don't know. I mean, I love hearing from people that have worked on the investment banking side leading up to and during the crisis. It would have been really, really cool opportunity for me. But I guess if I could have done anything, if I could have had like any career path, so to speak, or maybe done something differently, it would have been after working in Italy. I think what I would have done is, and I don't know that this is even possible. This is like some kind of artificial. I would, first of all, it wouldn't have even been financially feasible. But I suppose if we're just kind of dreaming here, if I had some kind of educational grant and I had the ability to construct educational programs that were particular to physical places. So let's say I wanted to study the political economy of Malaysia. And so I could have a course constructed that taught me some political history, some financial history, economic history, cultural history, and I could go to Malaysia and study the place and the language and everything. That would have been really cool. And I could imagine I would love to have gone to Russia to study Soviet Russia, which I did a little bit of at NYU, but then also post-Soviet Russia. I mean, that stuff would have been so cool. That would be so cool. That's the thing. Like, you can only read so much, but there's nothing like actual experience. And that's actually interesting because that was my point about Lehman Brothers. Like, I've studied the financial crisis. I worked very briefly in finance, but my knowledge of the industry comes from speaking with people that were there, that are there now, and conceptually, and to the extent that I have my own experience as an investor. But that's the thing. I mean, there's nothing. And so if I were to give advice, I don't know if you were asking me that, Ghazi, you aren't, but someone asked about the advice. I would just say, like, go for experiences. Like, say yes to experiences. My experience working in TV, like, you can read all the books in the world. Like, I read Brian Stelter's Top of the Morning, which is a really cool book on the history of morning television. Or maybe it's not the history of morning television. Maybe it's the history of modern history of morning television from like the 90s. And the three major shows, CBS This Morning, Today, and Good Morning America. And there was so much that was relatable. Similarly, by the way, I think the show on HBO was called The Morning Show or something like that. It's the one with Jennifer Aniston and Reese Witherspoon. So much there that was relatable. Not the executive producer. His character wasn't, but like, man, they really nailed a lot of that. But the experience of actually working in TV and knowing what the rhythms are like, you can't learn that from a book. So I would say just take every experience you can, and it just enriches you in ways that no books can. Last question from I decided to just plow through now. I got a second wind. Last question from the career bunch. Was a bunch of questions that Kate organized as career questions. This one is by Ian Fordyce. Ian asks, what are my views on Russia today? What impressions did RT leave upon you, if any? And how do you view it today compared to when you worked there? Man, I have so many bittersweet memories and feelings about RT. This is kind of like that other question about like what I learned from facing death and the mystery and stuff. I can't possibly do this question justice. I mean, I would start by separating RT as an institution and the public questions surrounding it, and RT as a personal experience, what it meant for me, the relationships I formed, the friends I made, the opportunities that the organization gave me that I wouldn't have had otherwise, and the place that it holds in my life and in my heart. And I'll try to speak to both of those. In terms of the first, in terms of what it meant for me, RT gave me a chance to do something that I would never have had the opportunity to do otherwise, namely to create a news program that was critical of the establishment, that spoke truth to power, that criticized the financial system, that criticized the central banking model at a time when you couldn't possibly speak honestly about that. And, I want to also preface that speaking honestly just meant saying what I thought was true. And in the years since, I've really refined and revisited many of what I think were misconceptions, well-meaning misconceptions that I had at the time. I was overly simplifying the world and breaking things down into good and evil. Investment banks, central banks, bad, the population savers, good. But to the extent that I was operating from a place of honesty and with good intentions, I think RT was a really special place. And it was, I think, people who maybe weren't culturally attuned at that time, it's difficult for folks to understand what an important part of the countercultural movement of the time RT played. There was this kind of intellectual, and in the case of finance and macro and economics, a kind of financial counterculture. And in fact, I remember when Lauren and I, who was the host of the program of Capital Account at the time, were in New York City, which was rare because we produced the show from Washington, D.C., but we took a couple of trips to New York to do some shows from there, and we had also taken a few trips for other reasons. And I remember once being invited to a party at Chris Whalen's house, who was, where was Chris at the time? I can't remember where he worked, but regardless, there were a lot of people invited to the party, and someone saw us as we were headed to the elevator. He got into the elevator with us. He goes, "I know you guys. You guys are leading the financial counterculture." And I can't tell you how proud that kind of stuff made me. It was awesome. And that was what RT was. It was the counterculture, the political counterculture, the financial counterculture. But of course, it was embedded inside of this Russian propaganda machine. And I was fully aware of that. It wasn't that I wasn't aware that we couldn't say a negative thing about Vladimir Putin. We couldn't also speak negatively about China. There were a couple of instances that I could remember where I really tried or wanted to talk about all the negative aspects around China, specifically their economic model and all the debt that they had built up, all the malinvestment, all the ghost cities. And I don't remember all the details around it, but I distinctly remember feeling like there was an urgent pushback from the executives that was not kosher. And it was made clear to us on multiple occasions that was not kosher. Though I will say something interesting about RT and the head of the American network, because again, there was RT, which is in Moscow, and then there was this organization called RT America, which was actually not RT. It's this weird structure where it was owned by an American, a Russian American, or a Russian with American citizenship. I don't know what the owner of RT America was, but he was Russian for sure. And that's the other thing, like, it was really Russian. Like, it was very Soviet, actually, is what I would call it. It felt very Soviet. The culture within RT felt Soviet. The ownership of the actual entity felt more sort of post-Cold War Russian, kind of kleptocratic Russian. And so it was a private company that employed us, but it took orders from Moscow. So it was never lost upon us that it was a propaganda machine. And I pushed the limits as well as I could. But the reality is I didn't really care. I didn't care to criticize the Russian economy or its political system. I didn't care to criticize political systems in general because the show was so economically focused. To the extent that we criticized politics, it was related to central banking. So that was never an issue. It was an issue for China, but it was a small thing. That wasn't my primary concern. And I got to also work with really some amazing people. The executives were very difficult, and I have mixed feelings about my experience there. The guy who hired me, for all his faults, I got a lot of love for him, even though, he may have hired me for his own personal reasons, but he gave me a chance to do something that I wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. He eventually left, and actually the reason that I ended up leaving was because he left. It wasn't because of my brain tumor, which coincided with that period. It was because a new guy came in and he made my life a living hell. He stripped me of my executive producer title, even though I created the show and he gave himself that title. He was a really insecure apparatchik. The guy really, it was, to this day, I don't really know. I sort of just let it go and I forgot about it, but I don't really understand how that guy got that job, other than to say that I think in Russian organizations like RT, and I don't know how true this is across the board. I don't know if it's more true for state-owned enterprises. I imagine it is. Loyalty is the most important thing. Competence is like at the very bottom. And that was made clear to me over and over and over again. So I didn't have any real love for the executives. They were all, for the most part, kind of corrupt. I found them to be corrupt, stupid in some cases, incompetent, bottom feeders. But the people I got to work with on a daily basis were absolutely wonderful people. And I made some of the best relationships of my life at RT, and they were forged under immense amounts of stress. And that's the thing. When you're working, I would wake up every morning with no idea what I was going to do that day. And I would put on my suit. I lived in DuPont Circle. I put on my shoes, which was a mistake. I should have gone to, and that became a problem later on because I was walking like a vast distance. I was walking like, 40 minutes or whatever. I can't remember what the length of my walk was, but in like dress shoes every day to go to work. And it was the most beautiful walk. I would walk from DuPont Circle, roughly, is kind of where I lived, all the way down to G Street. And I think it was 13th and G, past the White House. And I'd walk through the gardens in front of the White House and go to work. And it was just this amazing experience. And I would start my morning. I'd be first into the office before the rest of my team showed up, and I would start working on what the show would be, going through headlines, etc. I think we would have a team meeting at like 10 a.m., a pitch meeting, etc., going through ideas, kind of syncing up. And we had to be on air by 4 p.m. And I remember like what it was like to really be thrown into this experience as a young man with zero experience in TV. The very first week, one of our guests completely dropped. He didn't show up. And I had to go on air dressed as Uncle Sam because this was actually a Halloween episode. And I was supposed to come up on set at the very end as Uncle Sam, or as a broke Uncle Sam for like this funny segment. But I ended up having to actually do the guest spot. And Justine Underhill, who I hired out of college, so Justine later on went to Real Vision. In fact, a number of people that I worked with very closely, including someone I really love deeply, Mona Zugby, who ran the New York studio, also worked at Real Vision. So a number of people went there. Marina Portnaya, who was a correspondent, who was a good friend also, who didn't work with me on my team, but worked at RT, also went to Real Vision. So Real Vision took a lot of those folks because they were so talented and so hardworking. And that's the really thing that was so cool about RT. You had a certain type of person that went there. You didn't really have these privileged people that I think are, and not to disparage mainstream news, because some of the best people in media work in mainstream news for good reason. But you had scrappy players that occupied that, and those are my kind of folks. So anyway, Justine Underhill, to bring it back to Justine, she uploaded that segment to our Capital Account Facebook page after we ended the show as part of a tribute to Lauren and I, because it had never actually been published to our YouTube feed because it was so embarrassing. It went out on the broadcast feed that day, but that was because it had to. And that was a really important lesson that I learned, which is that in live TV, the show must go on. You know, at 4 o'clock p.m., you had to go live, and there were no excuses. You had no choice. So that experience of every single day going live at 4 p.m., having no idea what the show's going to look like when you wake up that morning, but having to make it work was an incredible privilege. It created a lot of stress, and you had to operate under that kind of stress, but I loved it. I actually learned something about myself during that period, which is I love being in a position where I have to perform under stress. And that's something that I haven't had to do since I ended that program. And I don't want to do it again because it's not healthy, but I feel so fortunate that I was able to do that. And so that's my experience of RT, the most honest, raw experience. I think the news organization is obviously not a serious news organization, but unfortunately, the mainstream American networks have trended in that direction. They engage in very similar types of propaganda and pontificating and really turning the network into a reality TV show. So that was my experience. Loved a lot of people that I got to work with. Became friends with so many interesting folks. Alona Minkowski, who had the Alona show. God, I miss Alona. We had so many great moments together. And there's so many other people who most viewers won't know because they were behind the scenes. And so that was my experience. Guys, I'm gonna end it here. We've run through all the personal, career-related questions. These are not even half the questions that I have on this document. The rest of the questions are all kind of macro-focused, financial stuff like deterioration of government, generational conflict, education, lots of interesting questions. What do I think about Web3, future of cities? There are so many great questions here, and I know that many of you want to hear my thoughts on the economy and on geopolitics, that I'm going to record a second one of these to try to include all of these questions together, but I will likely do that and release it on the Patreon feed, on the Overtime feed for subscribers. And I don't know exactly when that will be, but when I get some time, I guess the rest of August maybe, I will do that and I will release it for the rest of you. This was a lot of fun, everybody, and I hope you enjoyed it. For more information about this week's episode of Hidden Forces, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to Overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page at patreon.com/Hidden Forces. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.